Welcome to Hubs and Drivers, a podcast for building product marketers sponsored by BLD Marketing. I'm Jeff Donaldson, your host. On today's episode, brand unification, speaking with one voice. Welcome. As a building products manufacturer, it's likely that your organization has or will come across this specific challenge: multiple brands in one family, so to speak. Perhaps it's through mergers or acquisitions. Maybe it's through the acquisition of a specific product line. How do you unify those multiple brands under one heading or one umbrella? What steps do you need to take so that you are speaking with a clear, consistent, and compelling voice to your prospects and to your customers? It's key to succeeding in business. We have a host of BLD Marketing experts to chew on this today. During Hubs and Drivers, I'd like to introduce my colleagues here. Dave Sladek is President of BLD Marketing. Jeff St. Mars is Associate Creative Director. Jeff Jones, Director of Accounts. And Garrett Andre is our Creative Director. Gentlemen, welcome. This is an interesting challenge, and we've all worked with a variety of clients, or perhaps we've even been part of an organization that's gone through what you might call a brand unification strategy. Dave, I want to start with you. Where do you start when it comes to unifying multiple brands under one heading? What are the key considerations when you're about to take on this challenge? What's the mentality you have to have?
Yeah, there are a lot of considerations. You have to look at the brand portfolio. Is it a single brand? Do they have an existing naming convention? Everything from acquisition intent to recent acquisitions. So there's a lot of different reasons. For example, you look at and we like to classify them in terms of either a branded house or a house of brands. So a branded house is something like Apple, right? So everything is Apple, even the iPad, the Macintosh, whatever it might be. But then there's a house of brands. Okay, so like Procter and Gamble would be a house of brands. And so they have several brands. There's some commonality, but maybe not. I mean, they're all in maybe consumer packaged goods and that's it, but they're very, very different. And so when you think about that, the Apple consumer, you could say that they're different in a lot of different ways, but there's the power of that Apple brand. It's very, very unifying, and they stay to what they do, and that is just making it easy electronics. Whereas Procter and Gamble, they acquire brands continually, right? And so even though they're all consumer packaged goods, you might have various different target markets for each of them. Right. And so it starts there in understanding some of those dynamics.
How does that ripple to creative? When you're dealing with brands under one umbrella, perhaps they have different color palettes, they have different logos and taglines, and they have different connective tissue in terms of their own visual identity. And Jeff St. Mars, of course, you're a designer by trade. How does that cascade to that part of unifying those brands? What do you have to do when you're dealing with multiple brands that are sort of under one house?
Looking at Procter & Gamble, for example, those brands that Procter & Gamble has acquired or has owned forever, they're very distinct. I don't know that I could name any unifying element of all their brands that says, "Oh, that's Procter & Gamble." So that's they've done that, I think, on purpose. That they have these well established. I always think of Crest. I think that's a Procter & Gamble brand, but there's nothing about the Crest that is differentiating it from a lotion. I don't know these brands, but they're all different in their look and in their colors, and like what Dave's saying, who they're targeted to.
And interestingly, with Procter & Gamble, not only do they have a lot of separate brands that are very exclusive to certain product categories, but they also have another commonality, and that's they have a lot of brands that are like detergent. I think they have Tide, and Downy, and Gain. Yeah. So they have 3 different brands, probably targeting slightly different audiences.
And they need to differentiate those brands.
Exactly. Yeah. That's right. And so that requires you to say, okay, well, now the intention here is to keep them separate. Just real quick, one of the things that Procter & Gamble did, even though they are a house of brands, I think it was 2014 in the Winter Olympics at Sochi, they came out with a Procter & Gamble campaign. It was a campaign for moms. And the whole thing, and it didn't even sell product, but the whole thing was about moms in various different settings with their kids throughout the years. Like one was about hockey, speed skating, figure skating, whatever it was. And they were all it showed the progression over time of these moms making all these sacrificing, doing all these things. And then the end is they all made the Olympics. And at the very end of that commercial, it's like probably a 2-minute spot or so, they show all the brands. just
Yeah.
repeatedly at the end
That's
as a kind of a
nice.
close.
Right.
And that was the only sell. But that was a great way of establishing one overall master
Yeah,
brand.
yeah. The master brand is Procter & Gamble.
Exactly.
In other words, we sell products that your family are good for your family. We care about your family. We care about your kids. We're on the same side as you as parents.
And
as
that's the
making
common
right
denominator,
decisions. And our
exactly.
products are a right decision, or the good
Yeah.
decision.
So let's go back to what we deal with in terms of clients and prospects, and that's in the building and construction sector. There are times when competitors may end up in the same house of brands in some way. I've worked with clients in the past, I'm sure we all have, where competitors suddenly become strange bedfellows because of an acquisition. I remember in the electrical sector, I worked with two companies. One, in some sense, acquired another, and they were considered the parent brand. How do you work with a client to sort out which comes first and who rises to the top in some sense?
We had a client that owned two different metal building companies, and they, strategically decided to keep them separate, which makes sense because you want them to be competitively bidding against each other because no matter who wins, you win.
Somebody gets the business.
Somebody gets the business, right? So strategically, they don't want to make that connection. Not that they are, going to hide it from a legal standpoint, but just from an outward, what they're doing from a branding standpoint.
Bigger potential
messaging.
share of wallet.
Yeah. So they own both of them, and I think we've had several clients like that.
It's
have
also
rolled
that
up a particular industry.
they have a certain brand equity, associated with each of those companies, and so you want to keep that in place as well. I think that's part of the equation too. Is what is that brand equity in the space that they're working in, and that I think that influences where you go with naming, whether it's you take that approach of something by a said company. But I know that creates some challenges with the creative as well, tagging and such.
Yeah, I mean, one thought I had is if you're taking, let's say, an umbrella of logos and putting them under one, I mean, you have to consider brand recognition of one. Do we want to change this? Is this logo so recognizable that, maybe we can get away with changing the color, but the mark itself, the icon itself, it's so recognizable, let's not change that. If it's a smaller, lesser known brand, then yeah, maybe we can, start from scratch, do a little bit bigger of an overhaul.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jeff. We actually picked up a new piece of business, and it's a service provider in the building space, building construction space. And talking to him, he's like, yeah, I've got my brand, and I just acquired another brand about a year and a half ago. Oh, cool. Then what do you want to do? Well, what do you think? Should I just change the name? I said, well, what's happening with the brand? Is it a well-known brand? Does it have a good reputation? No, it has a terrible reputation.
So that answers that question, right?
But it's like, well, what do you do? Do you change it? But the problem is, it's a well-known brand in the marketplace.
It's a well-known bad brand.
It's a well-known bad brand, but it specializes in a certain area. So if you're going to change the name, it has to be very, very thoughtful in how you do it. You don't. The question, you have to do a lot of research and understanding and considering, like, what is the best track there? I mean, should you change it? Should you, put it under a master brand, or do you try to repair the reputation of that brand? And from your standpoint, if it's a specialized brand and there's some elements of it that are recognizable, at least in the marketplace, and when you feel you can, improve the reputation of it, then you don't want to screw around with the logo too much. Maybe just, fine tune it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that too. What I'm hearing, and I think it's the way that we operate, is strategically. Why are you making those changes? Why are you unifying or not unifying? There has to be a real solid, I think, business reason why you're doing that. Ultimately, is it for the betterment of the company? Is it something that in the long run is going to be beneficial? If it's not, don't just do it because, hey, we have to change. We have to change. Yeah. Change for the sake of change. I would never do that.
So you mentioned the two metal insulated metal panel companies earlier.
Well, those are metal buildings.
Metal building companies,
yeah.
We'll talk about who they are because they went through a couple of changes through a number of different acquisitions. And what you're seeing in the building and construction space is a lot of consolidation. There's like the Old Castles of the world out there. That's a branded house. I mean, they have like Sackcrete. They just bought E.P. Henry. They have Belgard, even competing paving companies that they're bringing under one roof. That's a branded house, but you're seeing a lot of that. What we're talking about is a company that's the brand name called Nucor, who's the master brand now. And they acquired Centria, they acquired Metal Span, and then they also had an in-house brand called TrueCore. They all make integrated insulated metal panels, okay? But the challenge there is, and by the way, they took more of an endorsement brand strategy where they keep the brand names, but it says a Nucor company, which is a third type, branded house of brands, endorsed. But the challenge there was really, really defining each of those brands in a particular segment so that they don't overlap entirely, knowing that at times they will, and that's okay too.
They're going to specialize in a certain part of the market, so that's where they identify.
Yeah, I think it was a great strategy for them too. I mean, you already had the one brand that was specializing in cold storage.
Right.
And you almost like if you know these brands, it's almost like they acquired them on purpose that way, I think.
Because they identify.
Yeah,
with
so they were very
certain-
strategic in those.
Right.
Here's the one that's like high-end architectural, one that's middle of the road, one that's very utilitarian, cold storage, and together, man, what a powerful brand. Oh, and then they created a brand for that group of companies. So it's Nucor Insulated Panel Group.
Right.
So through that one source, you're able to cover all these different segments of the market.
So how important is market research, audience mapping when it comes to such an exercise? What can the research tell you if you're going to at least consider a brand realignment or a change in brand or a shuffling of the deck, so to speak?
Yeah, well, the first thing is just reputation. You want to look and see what the reputations of each of those brands are. And then you want to look at the brand positioning of each, and I did some work with Ford Motor Company in the past, and they had a lot of different products. It was more of a master brand strategy, but kind of a hybrid because they also had Lincoln. But within the Ford brand, they had sub brands, right? So you had you had Mustang, you had Taurus, you had Explorer, Excursion, whatever they might be. The big thing there is they all have different target markets. Okay, so that's where you really have to have isolated strategies for each one, but one that can be not just segmented, but have some sort of layer of integration too. And so what you try to find are the commonalities, but you also try to find the distinction and find that balance between the two. And that helps out someone like Jeff, who, when you have to start designing, and let's say, we're giving an assignment and it's with a, kind of a master brand, and they have a bunch of hodgepodge of brands that they may have acquired and so forth. Like what would you do from a graphic standpoint to unify or to begin to do that?
Well, I guess the first step, would be to even ask, should they be unified? We're working with a client now who has a series of products. And each product is branded with its own unique logo that stands alone completely from the parent brand guidelines that you would expect to see. So between logos, there's no same font, there's no same color. So the first question is this smart? Is it good to have each product be branded its own way, where we can create its own unique, brochure, its own unique website if needed? Can we promote this in a unique way? Or to your point, if we say, they should be unified, they should have the same look and feel, then it's like kind of like what I said earlier. Like, can I borrow elements from this to remain true to its original form, but also bring it into a more unified look, whether it's all the same color but tweaking elements. Maybe it's maybe there's subtle ways to unify them from logo to logo where they all have rounded corners versus hard corners, or the font is serif. They're all serif fonts. They're all sans serif fonts. I would look for little cues like that to unify them. That's not over the top. It's not hitting you over the head with it. But when you step back and look at the big picture, there is some unification.
A thread of integration somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing with rebranding or this whole process of unifying the brand is change, isn't it? The fear of change. And are you affecting our current customers?
What are we
you
giving up? What are we leaving behind?
This disruption. And one thing that I've learned is that people have very short memories. Yeah. So as much as you think your brand is just, it's well known and it's solid, and what happens if it disappears or we change our brand? People are going to forget that brand in a very short period of time, unfortunately.
Well, we have a
or fortunately for them.
Yeah,
and I think it goes back to my bank. You were in banking too for a little while, right? And that happens all the time. One bank acquires a little regional bank, and so it's always like, oh my gosh, we're going to be letting these customers know that the name of their bank's going to change. Well, first of all, nobody likes changing banks because it's a huge hassle.
Nope.
So part of it is communications, and Jeff, you could probably speak to that if you want to.
No,
how important that is.
But I want to stay with this strain for a moment, because we have an example here in the Pittsburgh area right now where there are two healthcare systems in the region who have merged and have created a new brand for the two. And I guess I want to explore that a little bit further.
Who is it?
What is the triggering mechanism? It's Excella and the Butler Health System. And I know that they just recently joined.
Yeah, I saw that on
and I can't remember. It's unfortunate that right now I'm struggling to come up with the name of the new brand, but I think that's partly because it's not in the lexicon yet. It's not something that's it's
Which is
brand
part
new.
of the challenge.
Right,
part of the challenge,
exactly.
yeah.
We're proving the point. But I guess where I want to go is, what's the triggering mechanism to say to all the parties that be in a scenario like that? You've got two brands, whether they were adjacent or competing or in the same region or in the same space, and suddenly you decide to create a new brand for the former brands, for the previous brands. What's the triggering mechanism? How do you make that decision and make it stick and make sense?
Sounds to me like there's some egos involved there. You know, are we going to become Butler? Are we going to now? Actually, in that instance, you could see that their geography is probably expanding, and so let's dump the Butler name.
Well, they're separate geographies. That's true.
But I think it starts with research, right? And so you have to look at the reputations, the brand power, the recognition. You know, the CEO of Sunkist once said, you know, an orange is an orange is an orange until it's a Sunkist, a name that 80% of consumers know and trust. That's the power of a brand. So if you have two brands who decide they want to unite, I mean, there are some practical, rationales that have to really win out here, right?
Yeah.
Who's the more powerful brand? Who gives, who offers the best potential for future growth and power and
Do you think
achieving
egos
goals?
get in the way there?
Without a doubt.
But there's also the advantage of attracting a new audience, or in some sense creating a new dialogue when you launch a new brand in some way too, right? Isn't that fair to say in this instance?
I think that's the idea. Yeah. I mean, so whenever you have something like that happen, you want to borrow from the very best of each of the brands. In this case, you have Excella and Butler Butler Memorial Hospital up in Butler, PA. You know, what's the combination at? What's the strength of bringing both of those together? So that's strategy, but that also has to come through in some sort of message platform that says the power of two is four, not three.
And we're talking a lot about strategy. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and part of that is, well, you shared a healthcare system kind of merger, in the building and construction space. That's where a lot of the research that we do comes into play, because maybe you don't know which brand has the strength, right? But you want to have that conversation, but you don't only want to talk to, for instance, internal folks. You want to talk to your customers. And so having someone like a Build come in and be able to do that also opens up some objectivity to those conversations. Your customer's more likely to share the negative rather than just the positive if it's only the company on talking with them. So I think that informs a lot of what we do as well.
Without a doubt. And we do it, and to your point, we do it with customers. We'll do qualitative for things like that. If it's a bigger project and a bigger risk involved, we'll hire a third party and we'll do quantitative as well, and to achieve just that, to see what the brand, not only the power of each brand and the awareness levels, but also what the perception is of each too. And then that really becomes insightful in determining what this new powerful brand needs to look like.
Yeah, and what I like about it too is it kind of touches on the anecdotal piece of it, which is important, the word of mouth, the human part of the connection there, how the brand resonates there. And then also we're able to obviously match up all the digital types of research that you would expect, which again kind of gives you a rounded out look.
When you're unifying brands, we all know that cascades to so much. We're talking about the strategy, the research, the why, but there's the how as well. How do we accomplish it? How do we implement it? Websites, collateral materials, signage, vehicles, T-shirts, decals. There are so many things that represent the brand or carry the brand's essence in some way. Where do you start when it comes to something like that? We advise clients along those lines. Let's offer, in some sense, a guide.
We do, and that's the other fear that Garrett was referring to early. The first fear is just like, oh my gosh, is this the right move? Am I going to lose my clients? How are they going to react to this new brand? Are they going to recognize it? But the other fear is financial. It's a big commitment. If you are like, an organization that has a lot of locations or vehicles, and they're all branded, you're talking about a financial investment here. And so what we try to do in cases like that is we try to map something out like more on a vision horizon and kind of phase it, and say, look, let's just start here. Let's do the basics now. Let's get up and running. And then as things play out over a period of time, we can start to roll it out to some of the more physical materials.
And sometimes there's an interim step in some ways. You're still representing the previous brand if there's a full brand evolution, so that people become conditioned to the notion that there is a change, and then you go into full implementation. But there are huge implications there.
I like what you said there, Dave, because if you can make those changes as they come up, maybe you do set a date. You say, by this date, we're going to have everything switched over, but it doesn't all need to happen immediately. So
This comes first, this comes
Yeah.
second. Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly easier to start with the digital aspects of it. Social channels, websites, anything digital you can swap in out overnight. The physical stuff, trucks, buildings, signage, that stuff might take a little bit longer, but you can get a nice head start on the digital stuff.
there was a client that had a contest, an internal contest that said, if you find an old logo, you get a gift card or something like that. So they'd go through and, we forgot the mugs. It still has.
That's a good way to incentivize people
Yeah.
to adopt the new brand.
To adopt the new brand
Yeah.
and
Jeff, I had a question for you. Like, as you think about, you mentioned, I think, simplifying, right? Picking out certain elements for a logo. And how does that impact the design, as we were just talking about? Like, how do you take that kind of little thing and create a theme, create almost a cultural touchstone for the company through some of their visuals?
Well, I mean, honestly, a lot of it, I think, Dave, to your point earlier, is found in the research. Even from a pure design standpoint, the first step is always research, and even maybe it's visual research. Finding inspiration. I rarely start a project without finding a gallery of inspiration that I can pull from as I work on that project. Whether it's almost creating like mood boards for what I'm working on. So, you can scour the web, you can look through old books and find things. A lot of times it's that just gut reaction, like, this, I could see this having a part into something I want to do later. And then that stuff always kind of stews in the back of your head as you're developing, as you're learning more about the brands, as you're reading through the research. You can always, it's surprising how things just kind of jog your memory. Oh, I saw that thing one time. I can use that here. Make it my own.
Yeah, you want to
just
find
the
that
outer-
brand essence, right? You have to ladder up. We do something called benefit laddering a lot on the strategic side to help us really start that journey. So we look at what's the brand attributes? What are those benefits overall of the brand? And then more importantly, what are those emotional values, right? That really just, kind of like tugs at you deeply. Whether it's a contractor who, won't use any other nail gun because they know this one won't stick, and so they buy one brand, or it's an architect who just is so happy with a certain rain screen because it's a single, source component that really mitigates risk. Those brand loyalties are really, really important, but you have to understand their values and what makes them tick. Are they more aesthetic oriented? Are they more practically driven? Whatever that might be.
I love that benefit laddering exercise. We did that for a client. We came up with make a lasting impression. And it's so easy it was so much easier to come up with that once you lay the foundation of that pyramid going up.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, we talk about the graphics and everything else. I think the one thing that we do really, really well here, and I think it's because we're very thoughtful, and it goes back to a lot of the research and planning that we do, but we make sure we put rationales with everything. And I know you're really super good at that. Like, you're not going to develop a color or a design or even just some sort of strategy, unless it has some sort of rationale to it. Here's how it's connecting to that larger idea around the brand.
Well, the other thing to consider too is not only what the brand represents, but what you want the brand to feel. So you can almost give yourself, before you start a project, because design can be so subjective. One person can look at a logo and say, "Oh, this is the best logo I've ever seen." The next guy can look at the logo and say, "This logo sucks." So it helps from your perspective.
That's never happened though, right? You've never gone through anything like that.
800 names later, yeah.
From a pure design perspective, it helps to even, give yourself some guidelines and say, okay, going into this project, from the research, from what we found, we want this logo, we want this brand to feel X, Y, and Z. So at the end of the day, when you've come up with your options, you've landed on your one, you can subjectively stand back or objectively stand back and say, does this feel happy, fun, and friendly, or does it feel serious?
The tonality.
Yeah. So that's a great way to stand back and almost detach yourself from the design and say, did I accomplish what I set out to do? Does it feel this, and this?
Well, what's cool about that is that I've seen these guys work in this process and the creative team, and they'll not only do you just provide those rationales in that kind of question back and forth, but you also bucket things. So I think when you're early in the process, you guys do this an awful lot. It's like, okay, well, the brand could take maybe 4 different directions here, and so you start bucketing ideas under each, and then you kind of call the herd from there.
We're talking so much about how a brand unification strategy or a brand realignment is going to impact prospects and customers in the external audience, I want to take a moment and, in some sense, explore the notion that it's very important to make sure your backyard is cultivated appropriately as well, which means you have to condition your internal audience to understand why this change is occurring and help them along the journey, because they can be your best ambassadors. So I wanted to kind of throw that out there. I mean, from a communication standpoint, when I've gone through these exercises, it's a specific execution. You want to be able to develop a communication strategy that helps the internal audience get over the hurdles that you have to anticipate. It's almost like doing oppo research. Well, how are they going to object to it? What is it that they're going to see as a boundary or is in some sense an obstacle? How can we help them overcome that? How do we help them understand that this change will benefit the business, and how do we get them on board? Because they're the ones that are going to be interacting with your customers and prospects, talking to your neighbors, talking about the change at work. Wherever they are, they're an ambassador for you. So I kind of want to throw that on the table. Thoughts on that?
I think part of it is that, as we all have, we are our own best or worst critic. Similarly with a company, typically your employees may be your own worst critic as to what you create. And so to me, that's why it's so important, like some of the qualitative research that you do, because you bring in those voices so that we were talking about rationale. So it's not just this agency thinks it should be this, or the market thinks, no, it's collectively, we've taken this information and this is our rationale, this is why we're going this way. The other thing is, as you roll out the communication, what you should never have happen is your employees, your most valued asset, learn about your logo or your new marketing campaign from a news release.
Right.
I mean, it has to be internally shared first, and you build that community and that cultural touchstone of what you're going to be as a company and how this represents that. It's really
celebrate
important.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, and celebrate
Well,
it.
and ensure that you're achieving buy-in in many ways, because if they're involved in the process early on and they feel that in some sense they've been consulted. I remember, and this is stretching back to a company that was not necessarily changing its name, but was absolutely changing its look, its feel, its brand essence to some extent, and how it was positioning itself. And the CEO was smart, because he brought so many people in to not only talk about it, to have qualitative discussions, but to even be there when, as the agency, we started rolling out some of the creative executions, whether it was a logo or a color palette, and they all got the chance to buy in so that they felt as if they had some voice in it. And if you have some voice in it, then it's likely you're going to sign on to it and be an ambassador for
You
it.
want to be heard.
Yeah.
It's all that resistance to change. People just don't like it. There's some people that respond to that just very poorly.
Yeah.
And probably internally, there's probably worse reaction than externally. Because they're invested in the brand. This is the company I work for.
Yeah, why are you changing it?
I gave this
Yeah.
company 20 years, and now the name is.
You want to encourage
it's very
that
personal
passion,
to them.
for sure, but at some point you have to control it too. But merchandising is the first piece. But the other side is implementing it and implementing it the right way. And that's another. And I think we do a pretty good job of that with like brand guidelines, and we've got a pretty formal process. We'll even go down in some cases and do brand cues down to, okay, well, here's the kind of voice you should have. If it's an announcer on a radio spot, or here are some brand cues for wardrobe and things like that. Because the last thing you want to do is, especially in the building and construction industry, is look like a poser. Authenticity is key.
Yeah. So let's talk timing, and that's a big question, and I know it's situational, but when a company is looking at doing something like this, and it can have so many different manifestations to it, but what kind of time do you usually need to ascribe to something like this, where you start from the research and the strategy and the internal meetings and the discussions to design and development and messaging, and then the actual launch and the full incorporation and implementation? What's the timing like?
It could vary depending upon the scope and how many brands are involved. If it's a huge, multi-product portfolio or multi-brand portfolio, it can be timely. But even there, like the first step is, let's define the master brand, right? So, and usually, like, our engagements are, somewhat smaller than that, but they can be time consuming. Look, we take it through a phased approach, okay? Our planning really consists of doing some really strong discovery internally first, getting those stakeholders that we talked about early on, a cross-functional team of stakeholders from senior management, sales, marketing, product people, and just, some of the other folks that are in that brand, employed by that brand. And then we take it externally and we do very, very strong due diligence that way, whether often it's qualitative. Sometimes we will invest in the quantitative as well and bring a third party in. So if we do that, it takes a little bit more time. And then from there, we really go through some exercises, and we have a whole host of planning tools that we utilize just to get to branding. Some of those include doing some message hierarchy, which really just that benefit laddering, their brand laddering, what we talked about, and then that boils up to some value propositions, and then we unify that into one positioning statement. That positioning statement then is turned into a creative message platform that becomes the brand. Okay. That whole process could be anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 to 4 months, depending upon the scope.
I was
of
saying
the
like
assignment.
full implementation could be more than a year.
Yeah.
By the time it's
Without a
actually
doubt.
implemented.
Yeah.
Yeah, to get everything implemented. Yeah.
I was thinking, Jeff, the other example that occurred here recently in Pittsburgh was Heffron Tillotson and Baird. So Baird's a big financial services company, comes in and buys Heffron Tillotson.
Which is a locally owned, family-owned
Yeah,
company that has brand equity here in the area.
So you have a lot of customers, and what does that mean? This Baird's coming in here. I've been with Heffron Tillotson for years, handling my family, but their communications plan is what you expect. We're better than we were before through this merger, through Baird picking us up. And you working with Baird, you have access to so many more resources and
Bigger is better
and,
in some
and
sense.
capabilities and sophistication. And I think already Heffron Tillotson's gone. I mean, so they did that in a matter of, what was it, maybe 6 months?
I was going to say
start
about
to
6
finish?
months.
Yeah.
But they had aggressive external communication on
Yeah,
it too.
and that's
they committed
so
to,
how
it,
does
to
that,
an advertising campaign.
what do we do in the manufacturing or in the building products category in terms of communications, Jeff?
Well, I think it starts internally. I think it starts internally by getting people, in some sense, on board with what you're going to do and getting that buy-in, achieving that buy-in, having them participate in the process, and then being fully transparent as to how it's going to roll out. To your point, you don't want them reading about it or finding out about it somewhere else. They want to feel as if they're informed and empowered. You want to take them along the journey with you in many ways. And from a public relations standpoint, I think there are a variety of ways that you need to think about that. It has to be integrated with everything else you're doing, whether it's paid advertising, social media, digital communications, media relations, stakeholder communications. It all has to, in some sense, look and feel like a three-piece suit. And it all has to be integrated and consistent in the message. And that goes back to the research and all that you're talking about. It's that's the nucleus of the cell, so to speak, and that's the DNA by which everything else has to be drawn. But I think it needs to be logical and strategic and has to be rolled out systematically if it's going to work right. And the other key is, to your point, it has to be sustained. Just because you're so close to this and you've been involved with it as part of a brand team or as part of the management team or somebody that's the engineer on this, you may be tired of looking at it or thinking about it, but your external audience is just getting used to it. So it might be 3 months, 6 months, 9 months down the road where you're hearing it over and over and over again, and they're just getting used to it.
What about like your customers, like giving them advance notice? Rather than just the general public, to make them feel special, that, hey, this is going to be happening. You're in on this change. We want you to know. We want you to feel comfortable with this change.
It's a
Things
valuable-
are going to get even better with our products.
I think it's a worthwhile consideration, but then there are times when you want to be careful. Now, you're not releasing proprietary information. So in some sense, you're making yourself vulnerable in some ways if it's a secret that you don't want to let out at a certain time. So you're widening the circle.
Once you do that,
It becomes a soft
the genie's
launch.
out of the
The best experiences I've seen there is where it's more of a soft launch like that, and it's very methodical. Tell your customers, and then immediately after, within a week or so, you're doing more of a hard launch.
Yeah.
Also, you give those folks who are on the front lines talking to your customers those talking points. Mm-hmm. You say, okay, look, you start, if you want to share this on a Wednesday with your key customers, know that on Thursday that news release is going to go out, and then know that beginning on Friday through Monday and so on and so forth, the advertisement campaign is going to begin, so that again you kind of create, you plan the work the plan.
Well, it's almost like, and you've done this and I've done this, we've done it together. It's creating a toolbox for your people. So it's not just, here's a suggested email you can send out that will help condition your customers as to what's about to happen. And that's going to coincide with this news release that's going out. We're sending this to the media, but we want you to see this so you understand how the two connect. Now, here's a Q&A. Here are the questions we anticipate you're going to get from your prospects and your customers. Here's how we recommend you answer them so it ties back to the messaging that we're trying to develop, that we're trying to land in some sense as we're launching this brand. And here's when you need to pivot in some way and refer this to somebody else if there's a customer who's confused or frustrated, or it's really, I don't want to liken it to crisis communications, but there are some similarities to it because you're dealing with, this is planned change, whereas a crisis is an unplanned change. But it has some of the elements of crisis communications to it from a communication standpoint.
A good example is, and it's out of the realm of what we work on, but the recent death of the Queen. Once they knew that was going to happen, it triggered immediate communications and different things that were going to happen. And those had been planned years, decades in advance. But nonetheless, that kind of like, okay, when this happens, here we go. Here's how this will roll out and why that's important.
This has been a great discussion. Here's my parting question. I want you all to think about this. What's the one biggest mistake a brand can make when they're undertaking a brand unification strategy or potentially rebranding? Biggest mistake they can make?
Forgetting the old brand. I've seen that happen. They hang on to the old brand. They won't let it go. Even though they're rebranded, they say, we're new X brand, but we used to be this brand, this brand, this brand. Let it go. Move on. You've communicated. You've done your job. Move on, adopt, and embrace that new brand. Then people make that mistake.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think from my perspective, it's really, making that decision to unify versus keep the separate brands, and just really being thoughtful about that and understanding that, why. I think if all things were equal, we would say unify the brand. Why? Because it's the power of a single brand. Practically, from an investment standpoint, it's a heck of a lot easier, right, to just promote one brand overall. But we get it. There are other scenarios where that's just not possible. So we have to figure out ways that we can make some connections where appropriate, or create that separation. And it's but you have to be thoughtful about it in advance.
I would say don't forget or ignore your customers throughout the process, because how many times do you see a brand relaunch a new logo and everybody hates it, and they get trashed online because people, I think, are very they don't recognize it, but they're very loyal to the companies that they love. So if one little thing changes, like, how could you do that? I've seen instances where like cities or townships will create logos, and the people who live there and have to live with this, they lose their mind.
They move out.
But but you hear the opposite end. You hear it when the city or the company, in whatever case, they involve the internally you're speaking the customers, or if you focus groups, or make them feel heard as part of the process. They'll go along with the change a lot better. So that would be my thing is to not ignore or don't forget about the people who have to live with these changes.
Yeah, and building on that, I'd say it's so important to remember that the power of any brand is the people who stand behind it and the people who look to its promises to fulfill something they need in their life. And just remember that. It's the people behind the brand and who interact with the brand that are most important. So make sure you're paying attention to those folks during the process.
And I would agree with each of you. The other thing that I would say is if you're going to conduct this kind of an exercise, ensure that you're prepared to invest in it so it lands when you're doing it. You can't just make an announcement and then move on if you really want people to embrace this brand. There has to be resources and investment behind it to ensure that it is sustained over a period of time, or you've wasted your time in many ways. All the great planning and research is important, but if it's not implemented over a sustained period of time, you've got to give people time to get used to the change in some way. Throughout any brand unification strategy, regular communications to your internal and external audiences is key if you are going to succeed in the process. Everyone who interacts with the brand has to have a clear picture of the changes that are about to occur, and in many ways what they mean. The more they feel as if they've been informed about what's happening, the more readily they will interact in a positive way with the brand. Hey, would you like us to cover a specific topic on an upcoming edition of Hubs and Drivers? Well, email us your suggestions at info@hubsanddriverspodcast.com. That's info@hubsanddriverspodcast.com. And make sure to follow and like us on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. That's all for this edition of Hubs and Drivers. I'm Jeff Donaldson. Join us next time.